The Legend of Mysaides. Far over the western slopes of the eastern Weir Mountains roamed the red wizard, Mysaides. Though still young by elven reckoning, he had already mastered spells that older wizards scarcely dared attempt. He found himself one night beneath the light of a full moon. It just so happened that at that very moment, a nymph had chosen to bathe. Now, the thing about nymphs is this. They take their privacy very, very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that ancient enchantments protect them. Any mortal who gazes upon a nymph unbidden is destined to lose his mind. Yet Mysaides was no ordinary mortal. Being half-elven, the curse did not seize him all at once. Beneath the full moon, his mind remained his own. But as the moon waned, and the memory of that forbidden night faded from brilliance into dream, so too would his sanity slowly fade. Less and less would he remain the keen, half-elven adventuring wizard he had been. This, perhaps, was his first adventure. It certainly would not be his last. The nymph's name was Elalu of the Golden Leaf Circle, daughter of the forest and protector of the sacred ring. Whether she ever knew Mysaides was hidden among the brush, no tale has ever answered. But this was the beginning of his legend. Now, half-elves are not generally known for growing magnificent beards. At best, they manage patches. Elven blood preserves beauty while refusing whiskers, and Mysaides longed for the magnificent beard of a proper wizard. So, as the first full moon dwindled to a crescent, and the curse began nibbling at the edges of his reason, he crushed rice into a fine powder, mixed it with water, moss, twigs, and forest roots, and carefully pasted the mixture onto his face. When he admired himself in the reflection of a woodland pond, he saw an ancient sage whose beard would have impressed kings. To everyone else, he looked like a wandering hermit who had lost an argument with a swamp. Still, Mysaides smiled. "At last," he whispered, stroking the damp moss upon his chin. "A proper wizard's beard." It was the first outward sign that the curse had begun. Now it must be said that Mysaides was, by nature, an honest half-elf. He was courteous, generous when he could afford it, and morally upright. But as the moon continued to wane, he no longer questioned his honesty. He questioned reality itself. One evening, he wandered into a small farming village on the eastern side of the Weir Mountains. Hungry and without money, he carved 2 small wood chips and cloaked them in a glamour so convincing that they appeared to be heavy copper coins minted in some distant kingdom unknown to the villagers. The innkeeper accepted them without question. Mysaides enjoyed fresh bread, a hearty meal, a tankard of ale, a warm bath, and a feather bed far softer than the forest floor. Before retiring for the night, he even combed and straightened his magnificent moss beard with great satisfaction. Half-elves, you see, belong fully to neither world. Humans think elves drift carelessly through time. Elves think humans rush foolishly through life. A half-elf inherits both burdens. So Mysaides slept peacefully, convinced he had paid honestly for every comfort. But with the dawn, the glamour faded. The handsome foreign coins became nothing more than 2 ordinary wood chips. The innkeeper stared at them for a long while. Then he remembered the unusual traveller with crimson robes, pointed ears, and a beard made entirely of moss. Of all his guests, none had seemed more generous. And suddenly, none seemed more suspicious. Now, when the innkeeper discovered that his handsome foreign coins had become nothing more than 2 ordinary wood chips, he marched straight to the village sheriff with all the righteous indignation a cheated innkeeper could muster. The sheriff listened carefully, stroked his beard, and concluded that there was only one reasonable explanation. The Red Wizard. He summoned the village constable at once. "Go and arrest him." Now, this all took place as the moon was beginning its return. Whether it was a crescent or a half-moon, no one remembers with any certainty. What is remembered is that Mysaides had begun to recover just enough of his senses to become thoroughly confused by the world around him. The constable climbed the stairs of the inn and pounded upon the wizard's door. "Open up!" he shouted. "In the name of the sheriff, you stand accused of swindling Ethan, the innkeeper!" From within came only a sleepy mumble. "I don't believe I ordered breakfast." The constable frowned, though a nice cup of tea would be lovely. The constable's face reddened. He had been called many things during his years of service. A fool, a drunkard, once even a scarecrow with boots. But never had anyone mistaken him for a waiter. He struck the door again with renewed enthusiasm. "Mysaides, open this door immediately!" The pounding became so vigorous that Ethan himself came hurrying up the stairs. "Constable!" the innkeeper cried. "You're splintering my door!" The constable did not look away. "This is official business." "So is paying for a new door." "If I wanted my property destroyed," Ethan grumbled, "I'd have let the wizard do it himself." At last, the latch clicked. The door creaked open. There stood Mysaides, his magnificent moss beard hanging crookedly from one cheek, his crimson robes hopelessly wrinkled, and his eyes only half open. He blinked at the gathering. "What?" he asked politely. "Is all the banging about?" No one answered. "I wasn't expecting any repairs today." The constable had heard enough. He lunged forward, determined to seize the wizard's arms before any spell casting could begin. But though only half awake, Mysaides possessed the instincts of an accomplished magician. He drifted aside with surprising grace, causing the constable to grasp nothing but empty air. Mysaides squinted at him. "No, thank you." The constable stopped. "I don't dance!" Another attempt, another effortless sidestep. "And even if I did..." Mysaides yawned. "You're really not beautiful enough." The inn erupted with laughter. The constable, however, found nothing amusing. His ears burned scarlet. "I have had enough of this!" He marched to the stairwell and shouted toward the common room below. "Gwondor!" A deep voice answered. "What?" "I require assistance." Heavy footsteps shook the staircase. Each step sounded less like boots and more like someone dropping furniture from the roof. Into the hallway stepped the largest man Mysaides had ever seen. He was broad enough to make the doorway appear narrow and tall enough that he instinctively ducked beneath the ceiling beams. His braided hair hung to his shoulders. His beard would have made any dwarf jealous. And across his back rested a great two-handed bastard sword so large that sensible people generally avoided asking questions about it. This was Gwondor the Gargantuan. Originally from the western side of the Weir Mountains, he had recently hired himself out wherever strong arms were useful, whether that meant guarding caravans, splitting timber, or removing particularly troublesome customers from village taverns. Gwondor looked from the furious constable to the sleepy half-elf with the moss beard, and slowly scratched his head. "I'm terribly sorry," he rumbled. "Which one of you am I supposed to arrest?" Gwondor did his level best to seize the half-elf. It proved considerably more difficult than expected. Every time the barbarian lunged, Mysaides seemed to slip effortlessly aside. Left, right, a graceful turn, a lazy sidestep. Though his mind had become increasingly unreliable, his years of magical training had left his reflexes astonishingly sharp. Gwondor grasped nothing but empty air, again and again. The barbarian's patience, never renowned for its abundance, finally deserted him. "If I cannot catch the wizard," he frowned, "perhaps I can catch the beard." With one enormous hand, he seized the magnificent moss beard. He pulled hard. The carefully crafted masterpiece of rice paste, moss, twigs, and forest roots tore free in one magnificent clump, taking with it just enough skin to convince Mysaides that civilization itself had collapsed. The half-elf let out a howl that startled birds from trees half a mile away. "My beard!" He clutched his chin in horror. "You enormous oaf! What sort of uncivilized barbarian attempts to shave another gentleman by ripping his beard off with his bare hands?" He glared at Gwondor with wounded dignity. "I decide when I require a shave, and I much prefer razors, or, in an emergency, daggers." Gwondor blinked. Mysaides reached calmly into his robes and withdrew his spellbook. "This outrage cannot stand." He began hurriedly turning pages. No. Too much fire. Entirely too many frogs. Where did I put that one? Gwondor wisely decided this was not the proper moment to wait for the wizard to find the correct spell. He simply wrapped Mysaides in enough rope to secure a small fishing boat. "There." The barbarian nodded with satisfaction. That seems safer. And so the great wizard Mysaides, conqueror of absolutely nothing, defender of a beard that no longer existed, was carried into the village dungeon under one arm. One might imagine that imprisonment would inspire reflection, perhaps remorse, perhaps even an apology. It inspired none of those things. Instead, Mysaides became a remarkably demanding prisoner. When the jailer slid a bowl of thin oat porridge through the bars, Mysaides stared at it in utter disbelief. "I beg your pardon." The jailer looked up. "These are the worst eggs and bacon I have ever been served." He poked the porridge suspiciously. "They're terribly undercooked." The jailer blinked. "And where exactly?" Mysaides continued. "Did you find chickens capable of laying eggs made entirely of oats?" The jailer slowly closed the little serving hatch. From somewhere farther down the corridor, another prisoner called out, "Just tell him it's the chef's special." Mysaides sighed dramatically. "I shall be writing a very stern review." Nearly 7 days passed. With each passing night, the moon reclaimed another sliver of its silver crown. As it waxed, so too did Mysaides' reason. The strange certainty that had clouded his judgment began to lift like morning mist, leaving behind only scattered memories that seemed to belong to someone else. One morning, he awoke upon the hard prison cot, blinked several times, and looked thoughtfully around the stone cell. "I beg your pardon." The jailer looked up from his stool. "Why, precisely, am I imprisoned?" Word quickly reached Gwondor the Gargantuan, who had accepted the unenviable duty of watching the troublesome wizard until the sheriff decided his fate. Gwondor folded his massive arms. "You truly don't remember?" Mysaides frowned. "I remember traveling, an inn, a rather excellent stew." He paused. There was also an extraordinarily handsome wizard. Gwondor sighed. "That was you!" "I suspected as much." The barbarian leaned against the iron bars. "You paid Ethan the innkeeper with 2 carved pieces of wood disguised as foreign copper. You took his finest room, ate his best meal, drank 3 tankards of his summer ale, then slept on feather bedding while he thanked you for your generosity." Mysaides closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he quietly asked, "The glamour failed, didn't it?" "It did." The half-elf lowered his head. "I was afraid of that." Gwondor blinked. "You knew?" Mysaides nodded slowly. "The moon." He looked through the narrow window toward the pale daylight. "My mind changes with its light. Under the full moon, I am myself. As it wanes, I remain honest. yet I begin believing impossible things with complete certainty. He gave a weary smile. It is a dreadful curse. One can survive madness. It is far more difficult to survive believing one's madness is wisdom. For the first time since meeting him, Gwondor saw no trace of the eccentric fool who had mistaken porridge for bacon and oats for eggs. Instead, he saw a scholar, a magician, perhaps even a master. I owe Ethan restitution, Mysaides continued. Every copper, along with an apology. If he refuses both, I shall continue apologizing until he relents. Gwondor remained silent. The sincerity in the wizard's voice was impossible to mistake. At last, he spoke. There may be another way for you to repay your debt. Mysaides looked up. Have you ever studied petrification? The wizard's expression changed immediately. His eyes sharpened. Petrification? Yes. Cockatrice, basilisk, gorgon, Medusan curse, alchemical calcification, which variety? Gwondor stared. There are varieties? There are at least 17 documented forms, Mysaides replied matter-of-factly. 21 if one includes the disputed dwarven classifications, though I find those rather imaginative. The barbarian scratched his beard. I was hoping for a simpler answer. Mysaides smiled faintly. Most barbarians are. Gwondor chose to ignore the remark. It was a cockatrice. The wizard nodded at once. Excellent. Excellent? Relatively speaking. He stood and began pacing the cell. A cockatrice's curse is layered transmutation. Difficult, certainly, but not permanent. If the victim's soul remains bound to the body, reversal is entirely possible. Gwondor's heartbeat quickened. You know how? I know the theory. The theory? The practice depends upon ingredients. Gwondor sighed. There are always ingredients. There are, Mysaides admitted. Moonwort gathered before dawn, powdered crystal fern, the tear of a dryad willingly given, ash from an oak struck by midsummer lightning, and... He paused for a moment. One feather from the very cockatrice that cast the curse. Gwondor smiled. I have that. Mysaides stopped pacing. You what? I slew the creature. You slew a cockatrice? I did. How? Gwondor shrugged. I watched its reflection in my sword instead of looking at the beast itself. For the first time since entering the conversation, Mysaides laughed. A genuine laugh. That is either remarkably clever or astonishingly lucky. I've been accused of both. Gwondor reached into his pack and withdrew an iridescent feather that shimmered green and bronze even in the dim prison light. The towers of sorcery purchased the rest. Mysaides accepted the feather with the care of a jeweler handling a priceless gem. This alone would cost a kingdom. Gwondor's voice grew quieter. The woman I love was turned to stone. Mysaides looked up. What is her name? Lystar. The wizard bowed his head respectfully. Lystar of the Evergreen Wood? You know of her. I've read her poetry. Gwondor was surprised. She writes poetry? Quite beautifully. The barbarian smiled despite himself. I cannot read. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Mysaides carefully returned the feather. If the moon continues to wax, and if you can persuade the sheriff to release me, I believe we may yet restore her. Gwondor studied the half-elf for a long time. A week ago, he had been arguing that oatmeal was bacon. Today, he was discussing advanced transmutation with the confidence of an archmage. Gwondor could not decide which version of the wizard was more dangerous, nor could he decide which one he believed. But for Lystar, It was a chance worth taking. The following morning, after Gwondor had paid the sheriff the required fine and secured Mysaides' release, the two returned to Ethan's inn. Mysaides walked quietly. The closer they came to the tavern, the lower his head seemed to sink. When Ethan spotted the pair approaching, his smile disappeared. "You've come back." "I have," Mysaides answered. "Not because I deserve another meal, but because I owe you more than an apology." Ethan folded his arms. "I'll admit, I'm listening." "I should like to give your inn a gift." The innkeeper narrowed his eyes. "A magical gift?" "If you'll permit me." Ethan glanced toward Gwondor. The barbarian merely shrugged. "I'd let him." "Why?" "Because when the moon favors him, he's the cleverest wizard I've ever met." Ethan considered this for a long moment before stepping aside. "Very well. But if my roof starts floating, I shall do my utmost to fetch it back." Mysaides smiled. He approached the heavy oak door, placed one hand upon the weathered wood, and quietly opened his spellbook. Unlike the dramatic spells of wandering hedge wizards, there were no explosions, no crackling lightning, nor clouds of colored smoke. He simply spoke. The words sounded older than any language Ethan had ever heard. The runes carved into the wizard's staff glowed softly. Tiny threads of golden light drifted from his fingertips and disappeared into the wood. For several moments, nothing happened. Then Mysaides stepped back. "There." Ethan blinked. "There what?" "The enchantment is complete." The innkeeper frowned. "It looks exactly the same." "Walk toward it." Somewhat skeptically, Ethan obeyed. When he came within a few steps, the door swung open of its own accord. He froze. He stepped backward. The door quietly closed. He stepped forward again. The door welcomed him once more. Ethan repeated the experiment 4 or 5 times, laughing a little louder with each attempt. "My stars!" Mysaides folded his arms proudly. "You now possess an automatic door." "A what?" "An automatic door. It opens by itself." "I noticed." "It also closes by itself." "I noticed that as well." "It requires no maintenance. It never wears out. It does not complain. It never squeaks." "It doesn't?" "It does not." Mysaides smiled with the quiet satisfaction of an artist admiring his finished work. "I believe your guests shall find it most welcoming." Ethan stared at the enchanted doorway for nearly a minute. Finally, he turned. "I've never seen magic used for something." He searched for the proper word. "Useful." The wizard looked mildly offended. "I find usefulness to be among magic's finest qualities." Then he reached absent-mindedly toward his chin. He sighed. "I really shall have to grow another beard." Gwondor coughed politely. "Perhaps a real one this time." Mysaides looked genuinely puzzled. "I thought the last one was rather distinguished. It smelled like wet moss." "It was wet moss." "I know. It was authentic." Ethan laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "You know?" He disappeared into the kitchen. A few moments later, he returned carrying a wrapped bundle. Inside were thick slices of smoked bacon, 6 fresh eggs, a loaf of dark bread, several pickled vegetables, and a wedge of hard mountain cheese. "For the road." Mysaides bowed deeply. "You are kinder than I deserve." "You've paid your debt." The wizard shook his head. "No. I've merely begun. If ever I return to this side of the Weir Mountains, I shall bring honest coin." He smiled. and perhaps a story or two. Ethan extended his hand. I'll hold you to both. As the two travelers started down the road, Ethan leaned toward Gwondor and lowered his voice. Are you quite certain you wish to travel with him? Gwondor watched Mysaides stop every few paces to admire his enchanted door. I'm not certain of much. But every wizard I've spoken to insists Lystar cannot be saved. And he? He says she can. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I hope he's right. So do I. After a long silence, Ethan asked, do you know why he changes? Gwondor looked toward the morning sky, where the moon, though faint, could still be seen. No, but I intend to find out. The barbarian smiled to himself. I have a feeling. The journey will answer far more questions than I know enough to ask. Far ahead on the road, Mysaides suddenly stopped. He turned back toward the inn. I nearly forgot. Ethan called out. What now? The wizard grinned. You may wish to oil the hinges. The enchantment opens the door. But it cannot improve poor carpentry. Then, chuckling to himself, Mysaides continued down the road toward the evergreen wood, while Gwondor followed, wondering whether he had just hired the greatest wizard of the age, or the most peculiar. That evening, beneath the fullness of the moon, the two companions made camp upon the stony banks of the great river Avner. The river sang its endless song, water lapping gently against smooth stones polished by centuries of current. Gwondor unpacked the provisions Ethan had so generously provided. No sense letting good eggs spoil, the barbarian said, as he set an iron pan over the fire. Are you fond of eggs, half-elf? Quite fond, Mysaides replied, particularly with butter, and here. He reached into one of the many mysterious pockets sewn into his crimson robes and withdrew a tiny leather pouch. Black glooms. Gwondor frowned. Never heard of them. You've never eaten them. Grind them with the pommel of your sword. My sword? It is already heavy. You might as well let it earn its keep. Gwondor crushed the tiny black berries into a fragrant powder. Now add a pinch of salt. You carry salt into the wilderness? Mysaides looked genuinely surprised. Of course. What sort of wizard neglects seasoning? Gwondor chuckled. For the first time since beginning the journey, he thought perhaps traveling with a wizard might not be entirely unpleasant. A man who carried spices into the wild was, after all, a man who understood civilization. As the bacon sizzled and the eggs gently firmed in the pan, the two spoke long into the evening. Gwondor told of Lystar of the evergreen wood, of her laughter, of the adventures they had shared, of the day a cockatrice's dreadful gaze transformed her into cold grey stone. Mysaides listened without interruption. When Gwondor finished, the wizard quietly said, We shall do everything within our power. It was not a promise. It was something stronger. It was a vow. When the meal was finished, they agreed that Mysaides would take the first watch. Gwondor wrapped himself in his blanket and within moments snored with such enthusiasm that several nearby birds abandoned their nests. The moon climbed higher. Mysaides fought sleep as best he could. Every so often he slapped his own cheeks. Stay awake. The river continued its gentle rhythm. Lap, lap, lap. Then, splash. Mysaides opened his eyes. Another splash, not the sound of flowing water. Something was moving against the current. 4 shapes slowly rose from the river. Their skin shimmered with dark green scales. Their eyes glowed red and yellow like the lanterns of wicked fishermen. Instead of hair, Each possessed a shell-like crest resembling the back of a snapping turtle. River fiends, ancient predators. They delighted in waiting until travelers slept before dragging them beneath the water. They did not kill quickly. They simply held their victims beneath the surface until the river itself finished the work. 2 had already reached the shore. The other 2 remained waist-deep in the current. Mysaides quietly opened his spellbook. His fingers turned several pages before stopping. Perfect. He lifted one hand toward the river. Blue-white light gathered around his fingertips. Lightning bolt. The spell erupted with a deafening crack. Yet, to the surprise of the advancing fiends, Mysaides did not strike them. He struck the river. The lightning exploded across the surface of the water. Electric fire raced through the current. The 2 fiends, still standing in the river, convulsed violently before floating belly up toward the shore. Several unfortunate fish joined them. The remaining 2 fiends shrieked in fury. Behind Mysaides came another sound. Gwondor. What in all the mountains was that? The barbarian burst from his blankets, sword already in hand. He looked from the smoking river to the floating monsters, to the wizard calmly lowering his hand. You missed. Mysaides smiled. No. I simply chose the larger target. The 2 surviving river fiends answered with a howl that echoed across the moonlit waters. Then they charged. Gripping his massive steel bastard sword in both hands, Gwondor rushed the nearest river fiend. The creature hissed, spreading its clawed hands wide as though it intended to drag the barbarian beneath the black water and drown him by sheer enthusiasm. Gwondor gave it no such opportunity. With a great crescent slice of his blade, he cut clean through the beast's neck. The river fiend's head struck the stones and rolled once before coming to rest beside the fire. Gwondor turned toward Mysaides. That, he said, breathing hard, was not missing. He lifted his sword again, and that was a smaller target. The second river fiend, being far less interested in clever remarks than in murder, took advantage of the post swing. It leapt upon Gwondor's side and raked its claws across the barbarian's ribs. Gwondor bit his lip against the pain and shoved the creature away with his shoulder. So tell me, wizard, he growled, any more tricks up your sleeves, or do I just get the one? Mysaides, who had been hastily flipping through his spellbook, frowned with scholarly irritation. No, not that one. Too hot, too cold, entirely too many frogs. Why do I even have this page marked? The river fiend attacked again. This time, it sank its fangs into Gwondor's shoulder. Gwondor dropped his sword, seized the creature by the throat, and struck it in the face with a fist large enough to discourage most forms of conversation. The beast released him with a wet snarl. Mysaides snapped his spellbook shut, drew one of his daggers, and stabbed the creature from behind. The river fiend howled, finding itself suddenly outnumbered, wounded, and opposed by both a very large barbarian and a half-elven wizard with excellent knife placement. It decided that retreat was the better part of fiendish wisdom. It turned toward the river. Gwondor recovered his sword. With one final swing, he ended the creature's escape and sent it sprawling lifelessly across the stones. For a moment, there was no sound but the rushing of the river and the crackle of the campfire. Mysaides looked genuinely apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said. "I had not memorized many combat spells today. I shall make sure, now that I am traveling with you, to prepare a more practical assortment." Gwondor looked at the 2 dead river fiends on the shore, the 2 floating in the river, and the several unfortunate fish bobbing alongside them. "You had lightning." "Yes," said Mysaides, "just the one bolt." "One was enough." "Barely," Gwondor grunted. Then, the pain in his shoulder and ribs announced itself with renewed enthusiasm. Mysaides noticed at once. Those bites are not harmless. I've had worse. No doubt, but worse things do not make bad things pleasant. Sit down. Gwondor narrowed his eyes. Are you ordering me? I am treating you. That sounds similar. It is not. Sit. To Gwondor's surprise, he obeyed. Mysaides knelt beside him and began removing small pouches, folded cloths, vials, and herbs from the many hidden pockets of his crimson robes. His hands, so frantic a few moments earlier over the spellbook, now became steady and precise. He cleaned the claw marks first, then the bite. When he sprinkled a grey-green powder into the wound, it began to bubble and hiss. Gwondor stiffened. What is that? The venom reacting. Venom? Oh yes. River fiends possess a mild paralytic toxin in the bite. Mild, of course, being a relative term. Mild compared to a basilisk, serious compared to soup. That would have been useful to know before one bit me. I was occupied trying to find a spell that did not involve frogs. Mysaides applied a dark poultice and wrapped the wound tightly. We should harvest the venom sacs from the bodies in the shallows. Properly preserved, they may prove useful later. You want to collect poison from the things that try to eat us? Waste is a terrible habit. Gwondor stared at him. For the first time since their journey had begun, he realized this strange half-elf was not merely a madman who occasionally made sense. Beneath the eccentricities stood a trained and formidable wizard, one who could throw lightning into a river, disinfect venom, and discuss battlefield medicine as calmly as another man might discuss breakfast. Though, to be fair, Mysaides had already discussed breakfast under far stranger circumstances. Once Gwondor's wounds had been bound, Mysaides gathered several of the fish from the riverbank. Well, the wizard said, we may as well not let them go to waste. Gwondor glanced at the floating fiends. I'm beginning to see a pattern with you. Good. Patterns are very useful. They sat beside the fire again, while the moon shone full and white above the river Avner. Gwondor's shoulder still ached, but the poultice had dulled the pain and cleared the burning from the bite. After a long silence, Mysaides said, we should reach the mage's reagent market by tomorrow evening, if we follow the river road. That is where we buy the ingredients? Some of them. Some? Mysaides nodded. The first two should be fairly simple. Moonwort gathered before dawn can be purchased there, provided the seller is honest and the moonwort is truly moonwort. How much? 30 or 40 gold sovereigns, depending on freshness. Gwondor winced. And the second, powdered crystal fern. That sounds worse. It is beautiful, rare, and annoying to grind properly. Perhaps 120 sovereigns. Gwondor's face tightened. I do not have that much. No trouble. There is always money to be made. The venom sacs may fetch a respectable price. River fiend venom is valued by apothecaries, assassins, and certain types of theatre performers. Gwondor decided not to ask about the last group. And the rest? Mysaides counted on his fingers. The feather of the cockatrice that cast the curse, which you already possess. Ash from an oak struck by midsummer lightning, which I know where to find, though unfortunately it lies beyond the western side of the Weir Mountains, and then... He stopped. Gwondor watched him. And then? The difficult one. The expensive one. No, expensive is easy, difficult is different. Mysaides looked into the fire. A tear of a dryad, willingly given. Gwondor frowned. Can we not buy one? No. Steal one? No. Threaten one? Certainly not, unless you wish to spend the remainder of your life as a decorative shrub. Gwondor sat back with a grunt. What makes the tear so important? Mysaides turned slightly, and beneath the full moon, his expression took on that rare clarity that made him look less like a wandering eccentric and more like the great wizard he truly was. Each ingredient remembers something, he said. Gwondor waited. Moonwort remembers the light by which people gaze. It recalls the living sight, the act of beholding the world as a creature of flesh and breath. He reached for a stick and drew a small circle in the dirt beside the fire. Crystal fern remembers the purity before petrification. It holds the pattern of what was clean and unspoiled before the curse hardened life into stone. Gwondor nodded slowly. And the lightning oak? The ash remembers animation. Animation? The difference between us and stone is not merely movement. Stone has form, it has weight, it has endurance. But living flesh carries energy within it, an inward fire. Lightning reminds the spell that life was meant to move. Gwondor looked down at his bandaged shoulder. And the feather? The cockatrice feather remembers the curse given. A spell cannot be unwoven unless it remembers what was first woven into it. The barbarian was quiet for a time. Then he asked, "And the dryad's tear?" Mysaides did not answer immediately. The river moved in silver lines beneath the moonlight. At last, the wizard said, "The dryad's tear remembers the emotions and the history of the creature's life." Gwondor's face changed. Lystar's life. Yes. Mysaides' voice softened. Joy, grief, hope, fear, love, memory. The things stone cannot hold unless something living reminds it how. Gwondor stared into the fire. So, without the tear, you might restore movement. The wizard looked at him gravely. You might restore breath. He paused. But without memory, without the life within the life, you would not restore Lystar. Not truly. Gwondor's hand closed around the leather pouch that held the cockatrice feather. How does one get a dryad to give a tear willingly? Mysaides gave a small, tired smile. That is the dreadful part. Why? Because dryads cannot be bribed, bullied, deceived, or charmed by ordinary magic. Their roots go deeper than our cleverness. Then how? The wizard looked toward the dark trees beyond the riverbank. One must tell a story that changes her heart. Gwondor blinked. A story? Yes. You mean to say my beloved may remain stone because some ancient tree woman dislikes our tale? That is one way to put it. It is a stupid way! It is an accurate way. Gwondor exhaled through his nose. Mysaides continued. Dryads are ancient. Most have watched kingdoms rise, rot, and vanish. They have seen men swear eternal love beside saplings that later became forests. They have watched sons bury fathers and fathers bury sons. Time drains surprise from them. And when surprise leaves the heart, tears become difficult. Gwondor looked uneasy. I am not much of a storyteller. No, Mysaides agreed. That was not an invitation for agreement. I apologize. The half-elf glanced at him, and for the first time that night, his voice carried genuine warmth. But you are honest, Gwondor. The barbarian looked up. Mysaides had used his name. Not barbarian, not large fellow, not you. Gwondor. It was a small thing, perhaps, but small things sometimes mark larger turns in the road. Mysaides continued, and an honest story poorly told may yet move a heart that has grown weary of beautiful lies. Gwondor said nothing. The fire cracked softly. At last he asked, Where should we begin? With the market, moonwort and crystal fern first, then the dryad, then the lightning oak. And Lystar? Mysaides turned toward him. Where is she? Gwondor looked across the river toward the mountains black against the moonlit sky. Hidden, safe, in a cave beneath the western ridge, I could not bear to leave her in the open. Mysaides nodded. Good. Good. It means you did not abandon her. Gwondor's jaw tightened. I would never. I believe you. Those 3 words settled between them with more force than either expected. For a long while, they sat beside the river Avner while the fire burned low, the moon shone full, and 4 dead river fiends slowly became useful in the mind of a wizard who believed waste was a terrible habit. By dawn, they would continue toward the mage's reagent market. But that night, beneath the full moon, Gwondor began to suspect that the strange half-elf beside him was neither fraud nor fool. He was something far more dangerous. A great wizard, and perhaps, if the moon remained kind, a friend. Morning found them breaking camp beneath a sky still washed pale by the departing moon. Gwondor harvested the venom sacs from the fallen river fiends, while Mysaides carefully wrapped the remaining trout for the road. Neither spoke much. The events of the previous night had forged a quiet respect between them. With supplies gathered and wounds freshly bound, they turned their steps toward the wizard's crossroads and the hidden reagent market. For several days they traveled together without incident. The trout Mysaides had accidentally cooked with his lightning proved remarkably good eating. The wizard seasoned them with wild basil gathered along the riverbanks, together with a curious white root that Gwondor had never before encountered. What is this? The barbarian asked after the first bite. Citrus root. It tastes like lemons. It wishes to. I didn't know roots could wish. They generally do not. This one is simply ambitious. Gwondor decided it was wiser not to pursue the matter further. After several pleasant meals and many uneventful miles, the 2 travelers finally reached what appeared to be a lonely crossroads. Rolling green hills stretched in every direction. No village, no merchant caravans, no bustling marketplace, not even a shepherd. Gwondor slowly looked around before turning toward the wizard. I thought you said we were going to a market. We are. I see 4 roads. Correct. I see grass. Also correct. I see absolutely nothing that resembles a market. Mysaides smiled patiently. My dear gargantuan friend, not all marketplaces wish to be found. Gwondor folded his arms. The nearest city lies hundreds of leagues to the north. The smaller villages are to the west. You've brought me into the middle of nowhere. The moon is still full, Mysaides replied cheerfully. Have patience. The wizard began wandering about the crossroads, examining stones, peering beneath patches of moss, occasionally nodding to himself before moving on. No. He lifted another stone. Not that one. He examined the trunk of a weathered oak. Close. Finally, he stopped before what appeared to be an ordinary rain puddle resting in a shallow depression beside the road. There you are. Gwondor walked over. It's a puddle. Indeed. A muddy puddle. A particularly important muddy puddle. Gwondor stared at it. Mysaides. Yes, it is reflecting a cloud. As puddles often do. The barbarian rubbed his forehead. I am beginning to suspect the moon has affected more than one of us. The wizard chuckled. You insist upon looking at the world exactly as it appears. I generally find that useful. Wizards do not. Mysaides picked up a small pebble and dropped it into the puddle. Instead of ripples spreading across the surface, the water swallowed them. No sound, no splash, The puddle became perfectly still. Gwondor frowned. That is unusual. I should hope so. Mysaides tightened the straps on his satchel. The wizard's crossroads has remained hidden for nearly 800 years. And it is, he pointed, under that puddle. Gwondor looked from the puddle to Mysaides, back to the puddle. I refuse. You refuse? I absolutely refuse. It is scarcely 3 feet across. It is. And you expect me to jump into it? I do. I am considerably larger than 3 feet. Mysaides sighed. There are moments, Gwondor, when a man must stop measuring the world and simply trust it. I've trusted the world before. And it usually hits back. Without another word, Mysaides smiled, took 3 brisk steps, and leapt directly into the center of the puddle. Instead of striking muddy water, he vanished, completely. There was neither splash nor ripple. Only silence. Gwondor blinked. Then a voice echoed upward, as though carried by a distant cavern. Well? It was Mysaides. Are you coming? Gwondor looked once more at the empty crossroads. He looked at the puddle. Then he sighed the sigh of a man who had already made too many questionable decisions to stop now. I am going to regret this. Gathering his courage, he tightened his grip on his sword, took a running start, and jumped directly into the heart of the puddle.